Parliament returned today, and it's been a significant moment in the House of Representatives that we've seen in the last hour where the Prime Minister moved a motion to mark October 7. You would imagine there would be bipartisanship among the two major parties. That is not what unfolded. It's been quite an extraordinary hour or so here in Canberra. Let's bring in my colleague Andrew Clennell. And Andrew, it's rare on a moment of this importance, when you're talking about a country where we have had close relations to Israel for many years. This was an appalling terrorist attack upon that country. A major part of our society, the Jewish community, have so many links to that nation, and they weren't able to pause and move a motion where both the major parties agreed to it.
Peter Dutton and Anthony Albanese have met more than once this morning to try and get agreement on this. Peter Dutton's idea, he wrote to the Prime Minister on Saturday, and I'm going to read you some of Peter Dutton's motion, which I have now, the proposed motion that the Prime Minister dropped and put his own. Dutton's motion unequivocally condemns the attacks on Israel by Hamas and other terrorist organisations that took place 1 year ago, and the vow made by the perpetrators to repeat those attacks indefinitely, recognises that these heinous acts of terrorism took place after a long period of quiet at the Israel-Gaza borders, and as well as the taking of hostages and indiscriminate rocket fire by the terrorists, calls for the immediate and unconditional release of all remaining hostages, condemns the murder of hostages and the inhumane conditions and violence, including sexual violence on the hostages, stands with Israel and affirms its inherent right to defend itself and protect its citizens, recognises this entire conflict is between Israel and the Islamic Republic of Iran, and that the Islamic Republic of Iran acts through its proxies, all of whom are committed to the destruction of the State of Israel, acknowledges the devastating loss of life and mass displacement of Israelis and Palestinians as a result of the war sparked by Hamas. So it does mention Palestinians, but then it talks about anti-Semitism and says the Parliament will redouble its efforts against it. Well, Anthony Albanese put his own motion then, and there were three things the opposition objected to. One is calls for Iran to cease its destabilising actions, including through terrorist organisations, the Houthis, Hezbollah and Hamas, condemns Iran's attack on Israel and recognises Israel's right to defend itself. Well, that would seem along opposition lines. But then it says, stresses the need to break the cycle of violence and supports international efforts to de-escalate for a ceasefire in Gaza and in Lebanon, and for lasting peace and security for Israeli, Palestinian, Lebanese and all people in the region, and finally affirms its support for a two-state solution. So that was a bridge too far for Peter Dutton, who said, well, this is about the October 7 attacks. Let's concentrate on that. It's the anniversary now. And he said, look, I can't vote for your motion, Prime Minister. So he went and saw him at least twice today, as far as I understand it, and they couldn't come to an agreement. Anthony Albanese wasn't prepared to go with that form of words I read you earlier from Peter Dutton, talking about the October 7 attacks and more focused on Israel's position during the war. Well, Peter Dutton's gone up. He's quoted Bob Hawke, Paul Keating, Julia Gillard, Kevin Rudd, said they would have treated this issue differently to you. What a stoush this is. He said, Prime Minister, you stand condemned, as he responded to Anthony Albanese introducing his motion earlier.
Regrettably, we've not been able to arrive at a position of bipartisanship in relation to this matter. But of course, the Prime Minister is trying to speak out of both sides of his mouth. And that is not something that we will support in relation to this debate. There has been a position of bipartisanship on these issues, and your predecessors would have had the decency to respect the Jewish community in a way that you have not done today. And for that, Prime Minister, you should stand condemned. We have put to this Prime Minister a more than reasonable position.
So he could have let it through, the Prime Minister. He condemns the October 7 terror attacks, but he felt he had to add something about the lives of Lebanese and Gazans as well in this conflict, some terrible loss of life there. And this was the Prime Minister introducing his motion earlier.
October 7 will always be a day of pain. It is the terrorists of Hamas that are not only enemies of Israel, they are an enemy of the Palestinian people as well. The number of civilians who have lost their lives over the past year is a tragedy of horrific proportions. We know that it is only through diplomatic efforts as this cycle of conflict and bloodshed can be broken. Escalation denies diplomacy any chance of working.
The Prime Minister there, as he moved that failed motion, you could have a situation where the debate continues, where the Greens and the Coalition vote together. And I see, Andrew, all of this obviously in the context of ongoing conflict in the Middle East. We're on the other side of the planet, but it does have reverberations ahead of our election, which is 6 months away.
Clearly, the government's worried about some of those communities in Western Sydney and they feel they need their support. It's becoming more and more obvious. But I also think there's sympathy for the Palestinian cause from Penny Wong and Anthony Albanese. And every day Peter Dutton seeks to point this out, the government sort of emphasises that with their actions. I think the easier political thing here would have been to maybe make a couple of small amendments to this, suggest them, or vote for it, and then the government puts up its own motion tomorrow, perhaps. You know, with the sensitivity around October 7, which the Prime Minister and Premier of New South Wales themselves spoke about, in terms of protests. I think it's not occurring on the pro-Palestinian side on October 7. Now we've got a motion in the Parliament where the Prime Minister's trying to add things to it. It's also been put to me by Liberal sources that this will be, this motion, which Peter Dutton is now opposing, that'll be a test for the Teals as well. That'll be a test for those independent MPs to see whether they vote for the Albanese motion or they prefer this more pro-Israel motion.
Well, Zoe Daniel, one of those Teals, is speaking right now, the member for Goldstein, a seat where there is a large community of Australian members of the Australian Jewish community. Let's have a listen.
As they lined up at Auschwitz in 1944. As he told the Australian Jewish News in 2022, when we lined up and heard the screams from the SS, men one side, women and children the other side, my mother realised that she was not going to get out alive. And in those few precious moments, she told me, Abram, you should do everything humanly possible to survive. And when you will survive, wherever you will find yourself, you should tell people what actually happened. Abram's mother was immediately sent to the gas chambers. He has since kept his promise, telling his story with bravery, generosity and understanding to all. As he said at his birthday party on Sunday, there is no place for hate between people, no matter their colour. I have heard Abram speak several times, and each time I've learnt and grown from hearing his story. I have learnt about humanity. As we pass this anniversary, we must continue to pressure for the release of all hostages, to cease fire and to come to the table. This will require carefully calibrated...
Zoe Daniel there, the member for Goldstein. Where will she and the other Teals go on this vote in terms of the direct commemoration of October 7 losses and mourning the losses out of Israel and Australia's Jewish community, or broadening that out to the other elements, as we've been reporting into the Iranian conflict, Lebanon and the Gaza losses as well. This is a divide in foreign policy that we don't see that often in Canberra. We'll keep monitoring for you that debate.